We're covering 1 Samuel and 1 Chronicles right now. We've outlined each week the book of 1 Samuel with three major sections. The first of those we said was focused on Samuel 1 to 8, Saul 9 to 15, and then David starting in 16 and going through the end of the book, which we'll finish up next week. At the same time, we're going through the book of 1 Chronicles. We divided it into two major sections. The first 9 chapters are dealing with genealogies. And then the second section is the reign of David, beginning at chapter 10 and going through the end of the book. Before we go to 1 Samuel, real quick, 1 Chronicles 8 and 9 is in our class for tonight. 1 Chronicles 8 and 9. 1 Chronicles chapter 8 is dealing with the family tree of King Saul. It's dealing on down into the start of chapter 9. Verse 3 of chapter 9 beginning talks about now in Jerusalem the children of Judah dwelt, and some of the children of Benjamin and the children of Ephraim and Manasseh. And it lists those. It lists the priests who are in Jerusalem, 10 through 13. The Levites, 14 through 16. It lists the Levites that were the gatekeepers, 17 through 27. It lists other Levite responsibilities, 28 through 34, and then the family of King Saul, 35 through the end of the chapter. And that's what those two chapters are about. Finishing up that first section on the genealogy. So starting next week, we'll be out of those, or dealing with those extensively in 1 Chronicles. 1 Samuel chapter 25, the story of David and Abigail. 1 Samuel chapter 25. Verse 1 beginning, the death of Samuel. Then Samuel died, and the Israelites gathered together and lamented for him, and buried him at his home in Ramah. And David arose and went into the wilderness of Paran. So here in 1 Samuel 25 and in verse 1, we have the death of Samuel, this character that we've heard about, that the first major section of the book was about 1 through 8. That we remember all the way back in chapters 1 and 2, back before he was born and when he was a young child. And here in chapter 25, Samuel dies in verse 1. But the main focus of this story is focused on the story of David and Abigail and including Nabal as well. So beginning at verse 2, we have David's request of Nabal. Pick up with me in verse 2. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. And the man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep at Carmel. And the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. And she was a woman of good understanding and beautiful appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his doings. He was of the house of Caleb. And so here we have this description here given of Nabal and of his wife Abigail. Abigail is described as somebody of good understanding and beautiful in appearance, verse 3. This good understanding we're going to see as we move later on throughout this text. We're going to see that bore out even more. But her husband was described as a harsh man, evil in his doings. And that's important about Nabal, this description here. This is a harsh man who's evil in his doings. We're going to see that as we see the request that's made of how he responds to David's request. Let's finish the request and we'll see the response here in a second. When David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall say to him who lives in prosperity, peace be to you, peace to your house, and peace to all you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds were with us when we did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them all the while they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever comes to your hand to your servant and to your son, David." So David's requesting here, sending men to Nabal to request for some, whatever may come to his hand in verse 8, because they're coming upon a feast day here. So David sends his men, said, "Send them, greet him in my name, and go out to this man and request this of him." Keep in mind, how has Nabal already been described back in verse 2? He's harsh in verse 3. How else is he described? He's evil, and he's very rich. So this is a man that has plenty. You know, it would be one thing if David sent and requested of Nabal, and Nabal didn't have a whole lot, and so Nabal said, I can't give you anything. I'd like to help you, but I can't. But David's coming and requesting of Nabal, and Nabal is a very rich man, according to verse 2. He's very rich. And so David sends men to request of him. Now, what has David's men been doing with the men of Nabal? They've been protecting them. Here are the shepherds out and about. We did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them. And they've been out there sort of protecting them, and they've stayed away from them. They didn't do anything to the shepherds. All these men that David has. And so he goes and he makes his request of Nabal. You think if you look at it from Nabal's standpoint, this seems like a somewhat reasonable request. You're a rich man. They have helped take care of your shepherds, even though you didn't ask them, which is going to become important in a moment. But they did it of their own free will. They protected them. They've asked for something in return. And here's Nabal's response, beginning at verse 9. So when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in the name of David and waited. Now here's Nabal's answer. Who is David and who is the son of Jesse? There are my servants nowadays who break away each one from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from? So David's young men turned on their heels and went back, and they came back and told him all these words. So here they come to Nabal with a somewhat reasonable request of him. Could you give us what comes to your hand? They were coming upon the feast day. Here your men have been out here. We've protected them. We've done them no harm. Ask your shepherds. They can tell you we've done them no harm. And Nabal's answer is, who is David and who is the son of Jesse? I think it's important to understand at this point, I don't think it's that Nabal doesn't know. In fact, he even states who is David, who is the son of Jesse. And here are my servants. Here's what's happening with my servants. Why should I help you? Seems Nabal probably knows, very likely, Nabal knows who David is. You think about the reputation of David we've already seen. The reputation of David we'll see before he ever comes to the throne. Remember back a couple of chapters ago, as we saw last week, in chapter 21, when he comes before Achish, David does, and he acts like he's insane. Because they knew there that he was to be the next king in Israel. This is in the city of Gath. You think Nabal didn't know who this was? Everybody knew who David was. Unless you'd been living under a rock, everybody knew who David was. This is the man that's supposed to be the next king, and Saul is actively pursuing him. Right. He didn't want to share. Right. It was about Nabal, what Nabal wanted. So Nabal keeps for himself. He's not gonna give anything to help David. He doesn't want to help them. He's just whatever he wants is what he's gonna have. And so the young men now have to turn around after Nabal's told them, listen, why would I take my water, or my bread, my water, my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they are from? They've told him that they're from David. Again, surely he has to know of the reputation of David for everything that's going on with David. Surely he'd have to know of David's reputation, and yet he says, why would I give it to people that I don't know where they're from? That's what he says here before the men of David. Now come down into verse 13 with me. Now we have David's response to Nabal's response. Here's what David's response is to Nabal's selfish response. Every man gird on his sword. So every man girded on his sword. And David also girded on his sword, and about 400 men went with David, and 200 stayed with the supplies. David is angry with Nabal. But David's not just angry to the point that David's like, well, that's kind of aggravating. We have helped him out. We've not hurt his men. We've protected them out there. He don't want to give us anything in return. But this is not David being a little angry and being like, okay. David is angry to the point that he tells his men, every man gird on his sword. We're going to see here later on that he says that he's not going to leave one man of the household of Nabal. He's going to kill them all. That's how angry David is right now. Pick up in verse 14. Now when one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he reviled them. But the men were very good to us, and we were not hurt, nor did we miss anything as long as we accompanied them when we were in the fields. They were a wall to us both day and night all the time we were keeping the sheep. Now therefore know and consider what you will do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a scoundrel that one cannot speak to him. Here this man comes to her and says, listen, comes to Abigail and says, listen, they came and they made a request of our master and he reviled them. Here they came and made a request, and here are people that they have not hurt us. Nothing could get to us. They were a wall about us, both day and night, verse 16 says. All the time we were with them while keeping the sheep. No harm befell the people. Not only did David's men not harm them, but again, they did not allow anything to happen to them. You would think that Nabal should be grateful for that. No, nothing has become of all that he has. You know, here's a wealthy man. When you go back and you look at the description earlier of how much he has, that he has 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And you know, if he lost a sheep here or there, it might not be anything that he would notice. Well, I'm down to 2,999, you know, and counting off, okay, I've lost a sheep or two. But nothing was lost. All the time the men of David were with him. You know, it's significant that this isn't just somebody that just has sheep and goats, but this is something that's a livelihood for him. So, you know, if somebody has a bunch of goats, but they have it as a hobby, or somebody has a bunch of sheep, but they have it as a hobby, and they lose some here or there, that's not a major ordeal. Not as big an ordeal as it would be to somebody that's got it as a livelihood. The person that has it as a hobby versus a livelihood, you see, when it's your livelihood, like with Nabal, and that animal's dying, you're losing your investment there. Here's your money you've got. You're losing the very thing that's bringing you back your income. And all the time the men of David are with him, they don't lose a thing. Nothing was lost. It was all protected. You think Nabal should be grateful for that? You think if they hadn't been there, you'll lose some here or there, no matter how good your shepherds are. You can lose some sheep here or there when you have that many being rounded out. But as long as the soldiers and the men of David were there, they were protected. You think about him giving them some food. Yes, that might have been quite costly, but how much could he have lost if they hadn't been there? He should have been very grateful. And the men understood that. His servants understood that when one of them comes to Abigail and says, here's what these men did for us, and here's how our master treated them. His own servants understood that the way he treated them was not right. Like the statement down here in verse 17, now therefore know and consider what you will do. Know and consider what you will do. And by the way, the servants of Nabal, the servant here that's addressing Abigail, understands what else in verse 17? Two important things he understands in verse 17. He understands. Right? She has much more wisdom than Nabal has. What else does he understand? He understands harm's about to come to the house, and what else? There's one more thing. Nabal's worthless. He understands three things there. He understands Abigail has more wisdom about her, that she can handle the situation properly. He understands that David's men will come and harm them. By the way, you know, Nabal may have all of this and all these shepherds, but let me tell you, when David comes with 400 foot soldiers, that's not going to stand a chance against David's men. And then he understands that his master is a scoundrel and that one cannot speak to him. Nabal is so set in his ways that no one can reason with him or speak to him. You know, the way that David's speaking to him, sends his men to speak, is they address him respectfully. I mean, listen to what it says. Please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David. They address him, he sends them to talk respectfully to Nabal. They give a good reason as to why he should help them. But the servant here understands he's a scoundrel and no one can talk to him. You can't reason with Nabal. We'll see later on the statement that Abigail makes about her husband. That gives us more evidence of that. Right, he's on a high pedestal for himself. He's going to have to be brought low. And David's ready to bring him down low. We'll talk more in a second about David's response and how David's response was not proper either. David could have responded and handled it better. And Abigail understands that and talks to him here later. But let's talk about Abigail's response now. We've had Nabal's response to the request. We've had David's response to how Nabal responded to him. Here's Abigail's response. Now we'll see here who handles this in the best way of all of these. Listen to her response. Then Abigail, verse 18, made haste and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. And she said to her servants, go on before me, I am coming after you, but she did not tell her husband Nabal. So it was as she rode on the donkey that she went down under cover of the hill, and there were David and his men coming down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, surely in vain, verse 21, I have protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him, and he repaid me evil for good. May God do so and more also to the enemies of David, if I leave one male of all who belong to him by morning light. David is so angry, he's not going in just after Nabal, he's going to kill every male in the household. He's going to utterly defeat Nabal. Listen to Abigail in verse 23. When Abigail saw David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey, fell on her face before David, and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me, my Lord, on me let this iniquity be, and let your maidservant speak in your ears, and hear the words of your maidservant. Please do not let my Lord regard this scoundrel Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. His name means fool and folly. This is the very man he is. And folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Here's a man that's acting foolishly, and what Abigail says here is his mother named him right. As his name is, so is he. His name fits him. This man, and she called him here too, please let not my Lord regard this scoundrel Nabal. Not only do the servants know he's a scoundrel, his own wife knows he's a scoundrel. Don't regard this scoundrel Nabal. That's pretty bad. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, since the Lord has held you back from coming to bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek harm for my Lord be as Nabal. And now this present which your maidservant has brought to my Lord, let it be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your maidservant, verse 28, for the Lord will certainly make for my Lord an enduring house, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord, and evil is not found in you throughout your days. Here David, this man, angered, ready to respond, and Abigail comes to him and is talking to him here and says, let it be on me, verse 24. Again, verse 25, she talked about her husband's a scoundrel. But, I did not see the young men that you sent. Listen, he may have dealt harshly with you, but I didn't even see the young men that you sent. Now, in verse 26, Therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, since the Lord has held you back from coming to bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hand. You know, if Abigail had taken much longer to get to David, David might have already been ready to overtake the house. If it had been much longer before Abigail had gotten to David, David could have already been there and ready to kill him. But she got there and was able to stop him before he got to the house. She makes the point in verse 26, the Lord has kept you back. She's going to make the point later on about how he didn't shed the innocent blood. Down in verse 31, or blood without cause. So you've been held back from doing this day. So now take the present I'm giving you and forgive the trespass of your maidservant. Remember, she said back here earlier, to let this be on me. On me, my Lord, on me let this iniquity be. This is what Nabal had done that was angry. But she's saying, let it be on me. And she's pleading with him to forgive. And the Lord will certainly make for my Lord. So the Lord will make for David an enduring house, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord, and evil is not found in you throughout your days. So verse 29, yet a man has risen to pursue you and seek your life, but the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God, and the Lord, or in the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the pocket of a sling. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord has done for my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you ruler over Israel, that this will be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord, either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when the Lord has dealt with you, then remember your maidservant. Now, she makes a very good point here in verse 31. You know, this right now, as David is fleeing from Saul, and Nabal tells him no, is a major ordeal to David. This is a major ordeal that he says, no, we're not going to give you anything, because David's men have protected his men and kept him from losing anything. And she makes the point that when he's going to be the king, in verse 30 and 31, when you're appointed ruler, this will be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord. You know, when David's king, what Nabal's done to him, no matter how wrong it is not going to seem like a major ordeal to David. David as king is going to have a whole lot bigger things to deal with than a foolish man who says no despite people helping him. There's going to be a lot bigger things. And she's making the point, when you come to sit on the throne and you look back, this is going to seem like nothing to you. Either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. Now he has no grief either. You know, when this all is looking back, he could have killed Nabal, and David eventually, when his conscience set in, would have felt guilty for the fact that he killed Nabal and the men went with him. He shed blood without cause. What Nabal did was wrong, but it was not something that warranted David coming in and killing him and all his household. And now he doesn't have to worry about that anymore, because he's been stopped. And she's been able to come and talk to him. And so in verses 32 through 35, she's diffused the anger of David here. Listen to his response. Verse 32, blessed is the Lord God of Israel, who sent you to me this day to meet me. And blessed is your advice, and blessed are you, because you have kept me from coming to bloodshed and from avenging myself with my own hand. For indeed, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has kept me back from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come out to meet me, surely by morning light no males would have been left to Nabal. He was so ready here. It says in verse 25, he received from her hand what she had brought and said, go in peace to your house. See, I have heeded your voice and respected your person. You know, I think it's important to understand here too, as we're looking at 25, this is very different from the same David we saw a chapter earlier. Where in chapter 24, he says, I'm not going to raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. But remember, in that case, yes, he would have raised his hand against the Lord's anointed, but Saul was actively pursuing him. Saul sought the life of David. Nabal may have told him no, but Nabal wasn't pursuing to kill David. And this man over here who felt guilty about even cutting off the corner of Saul's robe, this man who says, the Lord will avenge me, was ready over here in chapter 25 when his anger got the best of him to avenge himself. And so here she comes and talks to him, and he's grateful that she came. And here's this woman with such wisdom and understanding that she can talk to David and diffuse the situation so David doesn't go on to kill Nabal and all that is in his house. And so beginning at verse 36, she returns. I went to Nabal, and there he was. He was holding a feast in his house, and it was like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. Therefore she told him nothing, little or much, until morning light. So it was in the morning when the wine had gone from Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, his heart died within him, and he became like a stone. Then it happened after about 10 days, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. And so in verse 39 through the end, he comes and he takes Abigail, and David takes Abigail, and he marries her. Now, the Lord strikes Nabal, and Nabal dies. The Lord took care of David. David didn't have to avenge himself, but David was ready to. I think that shows us the importance of the fact that when we can get angry, we can let the situation get out of control before we ever even realize it. If David had taken the time, knowing the man that we can see in David and what he says back here in chapters like 24, and the kind of person he is, if he had taken the time and thought it through, he likely would have responded appropriately. But he responded in a moment of anger. And that can tell us if we're responding out of anger, then we can respond improper just like David did. If someone like David, a man after God's own heart, a man that has all this, that always shows wisdom and understanding in the things he does, and yet here he is ready in a moment's notice in his anger to go out and avenge himself, then what could we do if we don't keep our anger under control? And so I think it's important we understand that, because the Lord ultimately takes care, as he did with Nabal here. It might not be that he strikes our enemies dead just like that, like he did with Nabal within 10 days, but the Lord will take care of us, and we don't have to let our anger get the best of us. If somebody's done us wrong, then we need to leave that to the Lord and not try and deal with that ourselves. 1 Samuel chapter 26. David spares Saul again. Beginning at verse 1. Beginning at verse 1 and going through verse 12. The Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is David not hiding in the hill of Hachilah opposite Jeshimon?" And so Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped at the hill of Hachilah, which is opposite Jeshimon, by the road. But David stayed in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul came after him in the wilderness. David therefore sent out spies and understood that Saul had indeed come. So David arose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. Verse 5. And David saw the place where Saul lay, and Abner the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Now Saul lay within the camp, with the people encamped all around him. Then David answered and said to Ahimelech the Hittite, and to Abishai the son of Zeruiah, brother of Joab, saying, "Who will go down with me in the camp?" And Abishai said, "I will go down with you." So David and Abishai came to the people by night. And there Saul lay sleeping within the camp, with his spear stuck in the ground by his head, and Abner and the people lay all around him. Then Abishai said to David, "God has delivered your enemy into your hands this day. Now therefore please let me strike him at once with the spear, right to the earth, and I will not have to strike him a second time." But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" David said furthermore, "As the Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come, or he shall go out to battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But please, take now the spear and the jug of water that are by his head, and let us go." So David took the spear and the jug of water by Saul's head, and they got away, and no man saw or knew it or woke, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. Well, we'll back up just a second here in chapter 26. We'll talk about David's response here with Saul, who's laying there again, and he has the opportunity to kill him. Let's back up into chapter 24. We remember last week, as we ended in chapter 24, back in chapter 24, here David spares Saul the first time. If you remember, this is where David cuts off the corner of Saul's robe, and he feels guilty about it, and he calls out to Saul. And he's calling out to him, and Saul responds and tells him, beginning at verse 17, "You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil." And he said, "And you have shown me this day how you have dealt well with me, for when the Lord delivered me into your hands, you did not kill me." Again, I'm reading in chapter 24, setting up this context, verse 19. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him get away safely? Therefore may the Lord reward you with good for which you have done to me this day. And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Therefore swear now to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and you will not destroy my name from my father's house. And so David swore to him, and Saul went home. And that's how chapter 24 ends. And it seems like when you come to the end of chapter 24, here things are finally starting to settle down somewhat for David. Here Saul seems to now understand, okay, David doesn't really seek my life as it's been painted all along, as Saul had imagined, as some of Saul's people were telling him that David sought his life to take the throne. Here he realizes that David had a chance and he didn't kill him. And so he goes back and he returns home. But that didn't last very long, because Saul comes back again here in chapter 26. When he's told where David is, he's ready again to go out and pursue him. He's going to go out and find him. Go out and kill David. So say all that to say, when we come here, we talk about David on two occasions where he spares Saul's life. And again, as Saul pointed out in chapter 24, how many people would have their enemy basically handed to them on a silver platter and let them get away? How many people would have the person actively pursuing their life right there before them to kill and let them get away? And David did that. He talked to Saul, and Saul said made it seem like he wasn't going to come back. Saul understood, but then he does come back a second time. So when David comes down a second time, as he comes down, and Abishai is there with him, and there lay Saul in a deep sleep, and the army around Saul, all in a deep sleep, with Abner, his commander, there, the spear in the ground, the jug of water there, that Saul was handed to him on a silver platter again. He's right there. It's not like the first time where David thinks, okay, where David could reason with Saul the first time and Saul leaves. He's reasoned with him once and he came back again. He's continuing to pursue him. And here Abishai looks at him and says, listen, David, if you'll give me the chance, I can strike him down right now. Here's the spear. I can pin him to the ground. I won't have to strike him twice. But the response of David, where he makes the point in verse 9, who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Who can? Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Here's his enemy, and he's making the point, not only will David not kill him, he'll not let Abishai kill him. Who can lift up your hand and be guiltless? You would have struck the Lord's anointed. And then David understands the fact that he's to become king. David will be the next king. He's been told that. Several times it's been mentioned, even by Saul himself, that David would be the next king, back in chapter 24. And so if David waits his time, the Lord will take care of Saul. The Lord lives, the Lord shall strike him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall go out to battle and perish. David understands that he's coming to the throne one way or the other. And Saul will, either the Lord will strike him, or he'll die of old age, or he'll die in battle. Something will happen, but Saul will die and David will be king. And so he understands that. So he makes the point in verse 11, the Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. The Lord forbid that I stretch out my hand and try and kill the king, to kill the Lord's anointed. But please take now the spear and jug of water that is by his head and let us go. So David says, I'm not going to kill him, nor are you going to kill him, but take his spear and his jug. Because here's evidence again when Saul and them wake up. Here's evidence again that David had the chance to take Saul's life, but he didn't. And it's got to show Saul the fact that the chance was there and David didn't do it again. David really does mean him no harm. So beginning verse 13 and going through the end, this is David and Saul's conversation. Very similar to what happens in 24. This time Abner is going to be involved in the conversation as well, though. Verse 13. David went over to the other side and stood on the top of the hill afar, a great distance between them, being between them. And David called out to the people and to Abner, the son of Ner, saying, Do you not answer, Abner? Abner answered and said, Who are you calling out to the king? David said to Abner, are you not a man? And who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not guarded the Lord? For one of the people came in to destroy your Lord the king. The thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not guarded your master, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the spear is and the jug of water that was by his head. He calls out to Abner, who's the commanding officer in the army of Saul. And Abner responds to him, and as they're going back and forth, David makes the point, you didn't protect the king. As the commander of his army, that's the job that falls on Abner. In fact, not only does David spare Saul, he makes the point to Abner, you deserve to die because you didn't guard your master, who's the Lord's anointed. Abner, you failed in what your job is. The spear is gone, the water jug is gone, you failed to protect him. That's your job, and you didn't protect him. Saul knew David's voice. Verse 17. And said, is that you? Is that your voice, my son David? And David said, it is my voice, my Lord, O king. And he said, why does my Lord thus pursue his servant? For what have I done, or what evil is in my hand? Now therefore, please let my Lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord has stirred you up against me, let him accept an offering. But if this is the children of men, may they be cursed before the Lord, for they have driven me out this day from sharing in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. So now, do not let my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a flea, as when one hunts a partridge in the mountains. So David talks to him again here, just like he does back in 24. Listen, what have I done to you, Saul? What have I done to you? And Saul is understanding what David's saying here as he's going back and forth. And he says in verse 21, I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will harm you no more, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Indeed, I have played the fool and erred exceedingly. And so David said, here is the king's spear. Let one of the young men come over and get it. Here Saul is now beginning to realize David has done him so much good. Remember last week when we talked about the priest back in chapter 22, where the priest is making the point there to Saul, who of Saul's servants is like David? Who, David has done more to the benefit of Saul than anyone in Saul's kingdom. And yet Saul pursued him because he knew he was to be the next king. And David spares him here twice. David does all this to help him prosper. David helps him take care of his enemies. We'll see that again in the next chapter. And Saul pursues him, and Saul now realizes, I have sinned, and that David had treated his life as precious. But Saul says, indeed, I played the fool and erred exceedingly. David did treat his life as precious. In fact, David, again, just like in chapter 24, here in 26, treats him with such respect. Look in verse 17 again. It is my voice, my Lord, O king. David's anointed to be king, but he treats Saul with such respect, knowing the position that Saul holds. He still will treat him respectfully despite everything that has gone on. So in verse 23, David does. May the Lord repay every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness, for the Lord delivered you into my hand today, but I would not stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. And indeed, as your life was valued much this day in my eyes, so let my life be valued much in the eyes of the Lord, and let him deliver me out of all this tribulation. And Saul said to David, may you be blessed, my son David. You shall both do great things and also still prevail. So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. And so David spares Saul again, and Saul looks at it and says, I've sinned. And he says, go, may you be blessed. And they go. David went on his way, and Saul returns to his place. Chapter 27, David in the land of Philistia. Verses 1 through 7 is where he flees there. And David said in his heart, now I shall perish someday by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than I should speedily escape to the land of the Philistines. And Saul will despair of me to seek me any more in any part of Israel. So I shall escape out of his hand. And David arose and went over to the 600 men who were with him to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, each man with his household, and David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelites, and Abigail the Carmelites, Nabal's widow. it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he sought him no more. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? So Achish gave him Ziklag, therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And David dwelt in the country of the Philistines, was 1 full year and 4 months. In the beginning of verse 8, this is important. Achish comes to respect David and to trust David. And all the meanwhile, David's going out and taking out the cities among the Philistines. He raided the Girashites, the Girzites, the Amalekites, from those nations and inhabitants of the land from old, is to go to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. Whenever David attacked the land, he left neither man nor woman alive, but took away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. So Achish asked him, and he tells him he hadn't been, he raided the southern areas of Judah and the southern areas of the Jerahmeelites and the southern areas of the Kenites. But here David's going back and forth and sort of destroying them from the inside. So when you come over later on, this is where he can be helping Saul, because here are Saul's enemies around him, and David and his men are going out, and they'll go over here and they'll kill everyone in this city and take all the stuff away. And then they may go over here to this city and they'll kill everyone in the city, and then they'll take the livestock, the oxen, and the apparel, and they'll take it back. So they're going through, and he's taking out all these cities along the way. So he's really starting to destroy them from the inside. They didn't expect David. What David told them, what David was telling Achish didn't think he was destroying the cities of the Philistines, but that's what David was doing all along, was taking out the cities of the Philistines. Now, we ran through that rather quickly, but let's talk about some practical lessons we learned before we conclude. What are some practical lessons we see in this text? Our dependence is upon God. Yes, we have to trust in Him. David didn't in chapter 25, but he shows his trust in chapter 26. Right. David wanted to seek his own vengeance, but eventually God took care of the situation. When it was left to the hands of God, God took care of it. What else do we see? What happens when you follow good advice? It's a good point. When you follow good advice, good can result. And David listened to Abigail's good advice, and good did follow. But if he didn't listen to good advice, and there are people, when you read in Scriptures, who ignored good advice. And it didn't end up well for them. But David, in this case, does listen to the good advice, and it ends up well with it. What else do we see? Can't change evil for good and good for evil. Good point. That's a good point. Using blessing others. It would have been one thing if Nabal had almost nothing. But this was a very wealthy man. Real quick, here's some things we see. Some people are ungrateful. We see that in Nabal. That here, David's men have helped and protected the men of Nabal. Nabal has lost nothing when David's men were there. Surely he should have been grateful for that. But he wasn't. If he was grateful, he'd have been willing to help David. But I see here, we talked about this earlier. People, when they're angry, people can think unreasonably. When we're thinking from anger. Now, it may be that somebody's angry and takes the time to calm down, and they may still be angry, but they're starting to think reasonably. But if we're thinking completely and totally out of anger, we're going to react and think unreasonably, and that's what David was doing in the story. Again, it was mentioned earlier, the importance of good advice. Here David received and listened to good advice. And in the end, he doesn't destroy Nabal. Respect to the leaders. David shows it time and time again to Saul. And we talk about at times in the New Testament that Nero was the leader when they should have respected him. But Saul's the leader trying to kill David, and he's showing respect to him. And then people have short memories. What I mean by that is here Saul quickly forgets all the good things that David has done, and that David sought him no harm. But he was ready to do David harm in the end anyway. Next week we'll finish the book of 1 Samuel along with 1 Chronicles chapter 10.